Hello and good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Business of Property. I'm your host, Cheryl Leong from Property Development Australia. So I begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet and pay respects to elders past and present. I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here today. So at the Business of Property, we interview superstar guests in the property development space that share their expertise, their deals, their stories to help empower, build, and grow our community of property investors and developers. So, hello, Facebook land, LinkedIn, and YouTube, and wherever else you are listening here today. Our guest is Steve Polisi from Polisi Property, and we haven't talked much about commercial property in property and the business of property. So this is, he is the person. He's grown a huge property portfolio on his own, a mix of residential but predominantly commercial property, which allowed him to leave the workforce at the age of 30. And he's now absolutely passionate about helping other people achieve their goals and financial freedom through commercial property. He secured about 1,000 plus properties and continues to do so at the moment, even all the way from the UK, which is pretty extraordinary. So without further ado, Steve, please join me on the Business of Property dance floor.
Hey Cheryl, how you going?
Yeah, I'm great. The Steve Polisi. How are you?
I forgot about that actually. I'm good. Yeah.
You're not just any Steve, you're the Steve.
I do CrossFit now at a gym, and there's 4 Steves in the class. It gets very confusing.
Yeah, so you're just like, I'm the number one Steve. Well, welcome, Steve, and thank you for getting up so early because it's. I think you said it was about 7 or 8 o'clock in the morning where you are.
No, that's fine. I wake up about 3-4 a.m. anyway for my clients in Australia.
That's awesome, and we were just talking about this before. I love that. The fact that you've been able to not only build up your own portfolio by business, which allows you to work and play from anywhere in the world, is amazing. Which is why we want to have you on the segment of the Business of Property, to talk about commercial property and how the fundamentals of commercial property investing that developers can apply to their projects. And hence we're talking about sort of commercial development 101. But let's start off a bit around what drew you towards commercial and not residential, like 90% of investors?
Yeah, that's fine. So I was originally an engineer, and much like every other investor, just started buying residential property, and that was my primary focus. And then when I left engineering, I actually became a residential buyer's agent. So of that 1,000 plus properties that I've secured, probably 600, actually probably more, 700 are residential properties. So I'm well versed in that space. I was literally just like everyone else. I put commercial in the too hard, too risky basket. And then just through work, I had one client who had a huge residential portfolio and said, "No, I want to buy a commercial, Steve. Let's have a look at commercial." And I said the same thing. I'm like, "No, it's too high risk, big vacancies, yada yada yada." And then actually had a look at some, and this would have been 5-6 years ago, and I was seeing like 9 to 12% net yields. Like you could go by, so not a gross like a residential, a net yield. And I was going back looking, you could buy like a medical center on a 7-year lease on a 9% net yield. And I actually thought I was stuffing something. I'm like, what am I missing here? This can't be legit. Like buying $1 million property and getting like a $60,000 passive income from it from the get-go. Like I was just like, I'm missing something here. And then couldn't find anything wrong. And then bought that one, then bought another one, and then started buying a couple every month. And then that went to 10, 12 a month. And I was just like, no, this is a game. If you get it right, the returns on commercial smash residential. But you can also burn yourself a lot easier. If you don't know what you're doing, there's a lot more duds. So you need to be mindful and more work. Like residential, you can go out, and as long as you don't buy a silly property, like in a mining town or a flood zone property or something like that, you'll be okay long term. You'll have a tenant. It'll keep tickets long. If it's negatively geared, $5,000 a year or something, you're not going to financially burn yourself. But if you go out and you buy a bad commercial and it does sit there vacant for 2, 3, 5 years, that's going to hurt. So way more moving parts, which I'm sure we'll get into on this chat.
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to address those sort of those risky and the thoughts around why so many people stay away from commercial. Let's start off. You talked about the high risk. Is it high risk, and what sort of risk are people referring to?
Yeah. So the first thing in the myth is when they say it's high risk, they say commercial's high risk. But
Yes.
what commercial are they talking about? Are they talking about an office space? Are they talking about retail, medical, industrial? There's so many types of commercial. It's not like comparing a 3-bedroom house with a 3-bedroom house. They're all completely different, all different risk profiles. The main risk they're talking about is they'll always have a friend or seen a property that sits there vacant for 2 or 3 years. And then they go, oh, that's the thing. But there's also like industrial at the moment. Vacancy rates are between 1 and 1.5% in most capital cities. So that's actually on par with most residential vacancy rates. The difference is you get it in one go. So like with residential, you might have 2 or 3 weeks vacancy every 2 years or 3 years or whatever it may be. Commercial, you'll have no vacancy for say 7 to 15 years. And then you'll have kind of 3 to 6 months for an industrial, that is. So that's that. But then different types of different types of commercial will have different vacancy and risk profiles. Like office space at the moment, high risk, high vacancies because people are working from home. You're also prone to like an oversupply because if it's like kind of buying like a high density apartment. You don't own a land component, and there's nothing stopping a developer buying a big block next to you and building another 20-story office tower and oversupplying the market there. So they can be high risk. So I always just follow the fundamentals. So stuff with a good land component. So that'll be industrial, suburban retail, and things like that. And then, like I said, it can vary so much. Like you can't compare a medical center that's in a converted residential property with one that's in a retail suburban strip with one that's in an office tower that's a specialized medical suite. They're all different pros, different cons. The businesses are going to be different risk profiles. The fit out costs are different. The lease terms are different. Every commercial you need to assess on a case-by-case basis. But to get to your question about the risk of vacancy, you can buy very, very low risk commercials like industrial, like I mentioned, really low risk at the moment. If you go buy, it's very high risk. So that's the main fear people have with commercial.
Yeah, and the length of vacancies, because like you said, the thought process is, oh, I've got industrial, I've got sort of one operator in there. If things go, to poop, it's going to be sitting there vacant for months on end.
It is, but you need to look at the grand scheme of things as well. And this is like an argument I had with a Sydney client yesterday was they were like saying, oh, no, I don't want to buy a commercial because it might sit there vacant for. But then we actually looked at it and like $1 million commercial is about 30, 40 grand a year passive income from the get-go. And then they were going to buy a property in Western Sydney for $1 million, which was about 5 or 10 grand a year negative. So my argument to them was in 5 years' time, when this lease finishes, you're actually going to be 120, 150 grand up. So you'll be 50 grand down on the residential, you'll be 150 grand up on the commercial. So even if it was vacant for 2 or 3 years, you're still in a cash flow positive position for that property. It's just with blinkers on, it seems like a lot in the short term. But if you kind of amortize it over the long term, it's actually not that risky. Like even if, say, I bought a bit of a dud and it was vacant for 2 years, over 10 years, if it was 8 years tenanted, you're still in a very, very high cash flow position from that property net result.
Yeah.
So just be mindful of that. It feels like a lot because in that moment it is, but you just budget for it. You have your buffers in place when leases are finishing. But like you mentioned with, the one tenant might leave. I just set on a property in Perth a couple of days ago, actually Friday last week, 5 tenants, $1,040,000, and it's got 5 tenants. So that mitigates some of those risks.
I was going to mention that as well, like similar to residential, I mean, diversifying your risk with multiple incomes as well. And then you sort of go, one tenant goes and it's not the end of the world sort of thing as well.
And a little tip and trick you can do, Cheryl, is when you buy multiple commercial properties, don't have them all ending the lease at the same time. So buy one where the lease ends in 2023, then the other one 2024, 125. So you actually only have to hold like a 1 year worth of buffer on one property because they're all shifting as they go from there. So you can mitigate the risk in many ways.
So let's talk about sort of development and the developers that are with us today thinking, okay, well, I've been really keen on commercial. First of all, is there a growing demand for commercial property? And I know commercial property is sort of lumped into, one, but there are all these different segments of there. One, is there a growing demand for more commercial property? And then two, what are the top three types, segments of commercial property that you see good opportunities for development and developing more of?
Yep, that's fine. So huge demand for commercial at the moment. Like the buyers agents popping up left, right, and center trying to sell. It's just buyers, especially Sydney, Melbourne, people where residential prices have gone through the roof. People are looking at a better way to get a return, which isn't basically playing the negative gearing aspect. So people are shifting to commercial. Like 5 years ago, if I mentioned the word commercial, everyone run a mile. Now I get 20 inquiries a day kind of on commercial. And it's just becoming more popular. Like idiots like me have written books. There's podcasts, there's webinars like this as well. It's becoming a much more known kind of asset class. So there's a lot more people kind of looking into it. And because the market's quite grown quite a lot in the last kind of 2 years, there's actually less sellers. So because all those people that are holding like a 10% net yielding asset, why are they going to sell it? Like where are they putting their money that they're getting a better cash flow return? So there's less properties on the market, but probably 5 times more buyers, and that's driving up price as well. So huge opportunity for developers. In terms of the space I'd be looking in, industrial is just basically the safest low risk one long term, because people always say, oh no, don't buy commercial, buy residential property. People need a roof over their head. And I always cheekily respond with, where do you think the roof came from? Like industrial properties are essential to life. Everything you touch in your life has been through 10 to 15 warehouses as a minimum. So you buying, say, like an industrial complex surrounded by residential property, that's always going to have demand. The more development infrastructure going in terms of population growth in that suburb increases the demand of your warehouse, because you're always going to need service-based businesses like spray paint, panel beaters, fabricators, things like that. Then you're going to need the distribution ones and the storage and things like that. So they're a really versatile space, and they've got land component and they've got versatility. So they tick those boxes there. So industrial would be the big one for me in terms of the next 5-10 years of strong front performer.
Yeah.
The other one, surprisingly, on the back of COVID, has actually been suburban retail. So not like we're talking like Westfields and things like that. We're talking near the little strip malls. So like the little 5-10 strip shops in suburbia that have the hairdresser, the medical center, the dentist, the barber shop, the massage, things like that. Those have actually done really well during COVID, because with the working from home culture, people are no longer seeking those services in CBDs. They're going to the local. So some of those areas of demand's kind of grown hugely. So I believe that in some of those upcoming kind of suburbs for your developers, there'll be some really good suburban retail kind of opportunities.
Yeah, and so how do we even start? Okay, we go back. All right, I want to invest in industrial. Well, I'm an investor. I come in. I want to invest in industrial, and Mr. or Mrs. Developer goes, all right, this is an area. How do I even pick what area is suitable for that sort of development?
Yeah, so this is going to come down to same as residential in some aspects. You're trying to cater for the demographic that you're servicing. So depending on what area you're actually looking in, you need to look at what is the purpose of industrial in that area. So if you're in like close to the CBD or that inner ring CBD, unless it's near the airport, it's very unlikely it's going to be a large scale fabrication business, for instance, because they'll get a much better bang for buck moving on the outskirts of the city, where for the same rent, they can rent somewhere 10 times the size. So those businesses are going to be the smaller ones, like the service-based ones, like the little fabricators and spray painters, and ones just to service like restaurants and cafes and things where they need a quick turnover. However, if it's, say, near an airport or a port, for instance, that's going to be a distribution-based kind of focus, because the people that are going to rent that space are doing turnover of product where they need to ship it out. So that'll be that focus there. So it just comes down to analyzing what the demand is and who's going to be renting that space, and then working it from there.
Okay, so similar sort of process that you go through with residential, but how do you, work out as in the types of service-based businesses you're catering for? And because there's obviously manufacturing, there's distribution, that sort of thing.
Yep. So one you just look at obviously the comparables in the area. The other golden nugget is speak with property managers. They know, like commercial property managers know exactly who's begging for spaces and where there's a waiting list.
Yeah,
And then
right.
that can be where your focus is. Because even like when you're building, say, an industrial, getting the mix right between industrial and, say, office space is quite important, because they've obviously got a mix between mezzanine areas and office spaces in each of the warehouse complex. Some of the more kind of white collar areas, they want to move their business in there, and they might say want a 50% warehouse floor space to a 50% office space. Whereas if you're catering for, say, those fabrication type ones, they don't care about the office space. That's only 10 to 20%. They want the actual floor space. So you cater for those needs as well. But property managers are worth their weight in gold. Speak to 2 or 3 property managers, find out the biggest demand. Some of them, there's a 3 to 6 month waiting list for properties. So if you can find that void and fill that void, you'll get top rent above market rate and fill it really quickly as well.
So obviously you're talking about commercial property agents who are specifically, you're not the run-of-the-mill residential property agent, or
commercial, specialized commercial property management. So there's a whole world of property management just for commercial, like there is residential.
Yeah, absolutely. And what you're saying is that these businesses and people are going to these people first, because it's quite counterintuitive, because generally, like, tenants don't go hunting for a property manager, but residential tenants don't go for property managers to say, are there any properties? Or they go on realestate.com. It's more what I'm hearing, it's more a proactive means of delivering stock, rather than it going, I'm just going to try and pick.
Yes and no. It's probably more comparable to, say, an owner-occupier buying a residential property, because they'll go to an open home and they'll put a bid in and they'll lose. And then the property manager will have them on their book. Sorry, the sales agent will have them on their books.
Yes.
And then they know when something else comes up, they can kind of send it to them and try to get the deal done. So that's more the case, because they'll inquire, like if they're actively looking on Real Commercial for places to lease, they're going to inquire on everything that comes on. So as soon as something comes on, they're obviously going to try to get it. And if they lose out, then they're sort of next in line in a way, but not really. But so they'll know exactly. And then the property managers will talk to all the tenants because they know what's going on. And local area experts always know, much like property managers, like for residential, they know exactly whether a 3-bedroom rents better than a 4-bedroom, whether they want pools or secure yards and things like that. They'll know those nuances that you need to know in that area.
Okay. So let's talk about yields. And I've got a question that I want to, someone in the audience has asked as well. Yields and the numbers. I mean, what's still achievable in the current market where you've got a very, very active market? Are you still able to get those 10% net yields, like you mentioned?
They're definitely not. So yields have compressed quite a lot. Yeah. Most capital cities I'm buying between 5 and 5.5% net. If you go outside of capital cities, like the Rockhamptons and the Townsvilles that carry a bit more risk in terms of vacancy rates, you can get 6.5 to kind of 7%. You can obviously get more, but generally, if you're kind of toying with that line, you're playing with fire.
Yes.
But just generally 5 to 5.5. You've got to remember as well, though, 5 years ago when we were getting 10% yields, interest rates were at kind of 4.5%, 5%. So now you can get an ANZ loan on 80% LVR for 30 years at 2.8%. So even though commercial loan. So even though you're getting half the yield, you're actually paying half the interest repayments as well. So the actual cash flow isn't that different. Again, it would have been great to buy that same property 5 years ago and you'd have double the cash flow now. But that's property. I tell people you can't get angry when property grows, because that's also why we buy property.
Yeah. And then, I guess this is the other thing, capital growth. Often people just go, okay, yield, commercial property, we're looking for the yield. I was going to say, is it a myth that there's not as much growth in capital in commercial property?
Yeah, this is my biggest bugbear of why people, I don't know why they say it. Where I think it comes from is, one, things like an office tower that is not going to grow the same as a house because it doesn't have a land component. It's similar to buying like a high density off the plan apartment. Like, it's not the same. So I think office space is kind of skewed a little bit. The factor why I think it comes from is the market doesn't move at the same time as residential, because you got longer leases. You don't actually realize the capital growth until a few years after the market's kind of moved, because when you renew the lease and they get a revalue, and it kind of comes that way. So all that happens, like all the residential people will have their properties grow for a few years and be like, oh, look, the commercial hasn't grown and my residential's grown quite a lot. What they're not talking about is when the residential stops growing and commercial keeps growing, that you're still getting the capital growth there. On average, for suburban retail and industrial, we're seeing between 5.2 and 6.4% on average in the last 30 years. So that's pretty similar to residential.
Yeah.
One of the things is it almost has to grow similar to residential, because if it didn't, you'd end up with a huge price disparity. Like if, say, 10 years ago in Melbourne or Sydney, you were buying $1 million house and next to it was a $500,000 warehouse, the residential house doesn't go to $2 million, and then the warehouse stays there at 500 grand, because anyone living in a $2 million house is going to look at that going, I'm getting more rent for that 500 grand warehouse. Why would I buy the house next door for $2 million? And then they shift and they move their money there. That's what usually happened. However, now we're in a kind of a crazy market where commercial's growing as well. We're seeing 20-30% growth in the last couple of years as well. So it is happening at the same time. But complete myth, you get really good, if not the same. I arguably think we're going to get better capital growth in the next 3 years in commercial as people look for cash flow over just kind of the capital growth play. But yeah, complete myth.
Yeah. The second myth would be, I think comes up quite often, you've got to be like, they're expensive. Commercial property is expensive, and expensive then we're talking about millions of dollars.
Yep.
Whereas I've seen properties 50, 10,000, 50,000, 100,000. Would you say, like, for people that are getting into the property space, that on average, what are the price ranges that you can see in commercial property?
Yeah, exactly right. That's a bit of a myth with, like, you have to spend a lot of money. And it's just because the news outlets obviously report the big businesses going in, like the Westfields and the Bunnings and things of those McDonald's sales and things like that. There's still lots of little warehouses, offices, retails and things like that. You can buy things as simple as a car park for obviously $20,000, $30,000. But in terms of getting into a good quality asset, I'd say you'd probably start at about $150K. That'll get you into a small warehouse. I bought a couple of months ago a warehouse on the Sunshine Coast for $180,000, which was just like a 90 square meter warehouse. You can get good stock like that, which is just versatile, simple. So anywhere from there. Then as you move into obviously the 500, 600K type stuff, you get kind of slightly larger, better quality tenants in terms of, like, they might have 2 or 3 staff, sign a 3x3, 4x4 lease. And then as you get into that $1 million plus, that can be a game changer. That's where you start looking at, like, the multi-tenancies, the freestandings and things like that. But again, these are all just kind of blanket rules. I bought a freestanding hairdresser in Toowoomba a couple months ago for $390,000. It's just a freestanding building, hairdresser, fresh 5-year lease. That stuff pops up as well. But again, there's a pro and con to everything. Yeah.
So question here, what questions do you wish new clients asked you more often?
Okay. I'll kind of rephrase this in a way. I'll tell you what they focus on, what they shouldn't focus on. Everyone in commercial seems to focus. They bring the residential mindset and they focus on price. They think, I need to buy something at the best price possible, and they miss out on some really good quality deals. Like for me, my focus is always in the next 10, 20 years when I make a purchase. So, like, if I'm buying $1 million commercial, and this is going to sound bad because I'm a buyer's agent and I know I'm supposed to get the best price possible, yada, yada, yada. It doesn't matter if you buy it at 980K or 1,020,000 if it's a good quality asset, because that's 40 grand a year positive. If you don't buy that and you sit there for 6 months trying to get a better deal, find that unicorn, you're actually in a worse net position. If I've got the option of getting a 980K property or 1,020,000 and they got the same yield of whatever it may be, but I think the 1,021 is a better quality property, I will buy that, because in 10 years' time, if it's worth $2 million, I don't care if I paid 980 or 1,020,000. For me, it's the quality of the asset. Long term, focus on good tenant, good location, good infrastructure spending, population growth, low vacancy rates in the region, good fit out costs. Focus on all those fundamentals first. and then the price is second to that.
Yeah. Two things I really want to cover in this session. One is around finance and understanding how you can go about buying commercial property. Do you need to worry about serviceability? Talk a little bit about these lease doc loans as well. So let's talk about the first one, serviceability. Do we need, like similar to residential, serviceability to purchase commercial?
Yep. So with commercial, there's different types of loans. So you've got the standard full doc loans, and then the lease doc loans, and then no doc loans as well. The first one, so the full doc loans is pretty similar to residential. So that's where they assess your income and your serviceability and all that type of stuff and get loan. The point to note is because we're a much higher cash flow from the property though. So when the banks apply their criteria, most banks are applying between 1.25 to 1.5% extra interest rates on the loan. They're looking at P&I, even if you're on interest-only loans anyway, and they're shading the rent of the property by 20%. So they're taking 20% off the rent, so effectively 80% occupancy levels. With a commercial, that property is still well in the green, whereas with a neutrally geared residential property, you do that criteria, you turn in the red pretty quick. So it still gives you a really good serviceability to keep moving forward. At some point, though, you'll hit your serviceability limit just from their risk profiling of your circumstances when they do the 5 C's of kind of credit rating, things like that.
Yeah.
So that's an option there. So if you're coming towards the end of your serviceability limit, looking at commercial is a good way to beef it up. Like if you've got a neutrally geared portfolio and they apply that criteria and it makes you 30, 40 grand negative, by buying a 40 grand positive property, you can bring that back to neutral. So you might be able to squeeze out another 1 or 2 properties. So there's mindful of that. Then not counter that, this is the main benefit of commercial lease doc loans. So that's a loan based on the strength of your lease. So they'll give you a loan, say buy your property with a 4-year lease on it. The banks will give you a 4-year loan for that property, typically on interest only. So they just take that property in isolation. There's a few criteria about your personal circumstances, but mainly it's the property itself. And then what happens is at the end of the 4-year lease, when that lease finishes and they renew, you go back to the lender, you get another valuation, and then you get another 4-year lease. So this is what most investors that have big portfolios would do. So like me personally, my last couple of commercials, lease doc loans is just so you can keep moving forward that way. There are a little bit of risks obviously with them. So the first one is obviously it's a higher interest rate because they're giving you money when other people won't. It's not outrageous. It's normally between 2.9 and kind of 3.6%. So it's still reasonably strong. And then what happens is at the end of the lease, if your tenant doesn't renew, you obviously then need to handle the mortgage repayment in full. Banks will normally increase the interest rate slightly for you. They will work with you, but you're going to have obviously a higher interest rate, sometimes up at around the 5% that you need to pay until you get the new tenant. Then you'll go back, refinance, get the lease doc loan and move forward that way.
Yeah, awesome. Got a few more questions here. So when investing, what was the best advice you were given, and also what was the worst advice you were given? Wow, some really deep questions.
Oh, that is a deep one. The best advice is going to sound just do your due diligence, but do it properly. It's not like residential where you can just have a look on kind of realestate.com and go, oh, that's a pretty picture. And that's why I get a lot of clients that go, oh, have you seen this one, Steve? And then I just say, have you checked this, and this? It's a lot of work. Before you even can make an offer on a commercial, there's probably 2 or 3 hours work just looking at comparable sales, comparable rents, looking at vacancy rates. It's not as simple as residential. You can't go on like SQM and check up vacancy rates. You actually have to talk to property managers, go on CoreLogic, find similar properties, look at their sales campaigns, their leasing campaigns, do all that kind of analysis first. Then you've got to analyze the tenant fit out, et cetera, et cetera. So actually just doing the work. So that's probably the best advice I've kind of given. The worst advice was some people said just buy based on yield. Don't worry about long term. Just buy based on yield. Chase yields. Get the cash flow no matter where it is. I've shifted since then. I now still capital growth is a huge focus for me because that's where you make a lot of your money. And to be honest, you'll get a better net return. Like if I can buy a property in Brisbane on a 5.5% yield versus a 6.5% one in say Townsville, I will go the 5.5% one if I think it's got better capital growth prospects and tighter vacancy rates, because tighter vacancy rates will bring me rental increases and capital growth. So I think my net result will actually be much better, and I'll also have lower risk in terms of that vacancy period where I'm not shooting myself in the foot for a couple of years where I can't invest because I have a vacant property.
Yeah. Oh, I did have a question around. I'm going to fill it in with this one first. Small industrial development in the right area and keeping and refinances on the basis of capitalized rate of rent. I think you can see that there. A viable option compared to standard residential development is a small industrial development in the right area and keep refinance. Okay. Yeah, got it.
Basically asking, is a small industrial development as good as a residential development? Yep. If you get the numbers right, it's 100%. One of the funny things I've actually found though with my clients that do the developments, the small developments, you actually make a better margin than the large ones, which is not normally always the case in residential. And by large, I'm talking the big boy large ones, like the $200 million ones, because the people that are doing those are normally kind of dispersing their risk over lots of investments. So they might have 7 to 10 of these developments all going at the same time. So they can have basically risk mitigate. They'll aim to make 6 to 10% profit, but because it's over 7 to 10 properties, some might make 15%, some might make 5%, and they kind of do that. They're just looking at a return based only. Whereas the smaller ones, you can still make that 15 to 25% profit. Again, if you know what you're doing. But again, it's about risk mitigation, building it depends what area you're buying in, but normally if you're trying to sell it with a tenant, because you'll get a slightly better bang for buck in terms of the price you sell it for, assuming you're buying an area where there's a huge interest for investors to buy tenanted properties. If it's an owner-occupied location, cool, you can sell them effectively off the plan and get it done, dusted early. But you need to handle basically the debt for a longer period, because it's not like residential where as soon as it's finished, someone moved in. What normally happens is, say you've got a strip of 10 warehouses. That takes a lot longer to fill than having one free in a group of 10 where 9 of them are full. Because normally businesses don't want to be the first one to jump on an empty warehouse. If there's a whole warehouse complex, the first one might actually take you 6 to 12 months to get a tenant. And you'll have to give them a rental concession. So you'll have to give them a reduced rent to get them in there for things. But then what happens is it exponentially speeds up the more you fill. So it might take you 6 to 18 months to kind of fill half of them. Then you'll fill the last half in 2 or 3 months because they all kind of jump on it. So it's about balancing those lease terms and incentives versus who you're planning to sell it to as well, which is where I probably come in.
Yeah. So my question was around refinance, by the way. So residential property, you could refinance every 3 months if you wanted to, sort of thing. Is it the same with commercial?
Yep. So with both full doc and lease doc, you can refinance wherever you want. The difference is you actually pay for valuations. It's not as simple as just doing a quick kind of desktop valuation. The banks give you a value and spit it out. They actually send someone to the property. They basically do what I do for due diligence. They give you a 40-page due diligence report on the property, finding out the comparable sales, leases, rents, all that type of stuff.
Yes.
So that's normally between, on a small standard residential commercial, $800 to $2,500. So you theoretically could do it, but you'd want to be sure that you're going to get a good value. Otherwise, you're just kind of throwing money down the drain. What most people do, though, is just do it at the end of the lease terms. So once they get the new fresh lease, they'll go back and pay that fee, knowing that they're most likely going to get a really strong valuation. However, case by case, like any of my clients that bought something 4 years ago on a 5-year lease, the market's moved so much in the last 2 years, they've gone back, paid the valuation, pulled out the money so they can go again. So there's a little bit more of a balancing act in terms of that.
Yeah. So let's talk about the tenants themselves. How much do you as the investor or even sort of the bank want the status of the tenant and their business?
Yep. So banks are just doing their risk profiling, the same as you should be doing. So there's certain asset classes and types of tenants they obviously don't like, and postcodes, for instance, not going to like mining towns. Certain tenants they hate at the moment. So they don't like buying banks because they foresee, which is funny because they are a bank, that they know they're reducing floor space. People don't walk into retail banks anymore. I've not been in a bank for 4 or 5 years. So they're always using floor space. So they know that's a risky tenant. So they'll red flag that. Petrol station, for instance, they know we're shifting to like electric cars. They're a high risk one environmentally as well, so they don't touch those. So they'll analyze it the same as you. They'll look at, make sure you get a good long-term tenant. They're loving industrial at the moment. They're loving suburban retail. They'll just mainly look at like who the tenant is and what the lease terms are, and then see how bulletproof it is around that.
Okay, cool. All right. We've got a question here. What are the red flags to look out for when engaging a buyer's agent? You've got some really good questions here, Steve.
This one's a hard one, and it's always the case with buyer's agents, because you don't know if you've got a good or bad buyer's agent until you've got a bad property under your cards. My life lesson here for whoever asked this question is never trust anyone in real estate, ever. Like, it's just a general, anyone who gets paid by someone, their incentive is to get paid, not you. There's only one person who cares about your financial well-being, and that's yourself. So make sure you're happy with every purchase. So if you're going to choose a buyer's agent, even when they send you information, go through it, make sure you're happy with it like you were buying it yourself. Get as educated as you can and go from there. Just talk to multiple buyer's agents. Ask to speak with kind of past clients and things like that. But it is such a weird one. Like in the past, like some of the properties I weren't fans of, my clients absolutely loved, and I told them the risks. And some of the properties I own in my portfolio, I've actually sent to clients first, and they said no to it, and I bought it myself. And it's because everyone's just got a preconceived notion of what's a good property. Some people like proximity to CBD. Some people want long lease terms. Some people want certain types of tenants. Some people want value add, development potential. So there's no criteria. No one's got a crystal ball. It's the same as how do you tell a good residential buyer's agent from a bad one? You don't know, because we're forecasting. But I buy boring properties. I buy just simple, good tenant, good locations, long leases, low vacancy rates. I keep it simple. The least exciting properties for me are generally the best performing ones.
Yeah. So going to sort of going on from tenants. So is it more hands-off than residential?
Yep, definitely so. And the main reason for that is tenants look after all the outgoings. So they look after council rates, water rates, maintenance of the property. If you're buying a property generally over the land tax threshold, they'll even pay your land tax bill. So the only outgoing you generally have to worry about is whatever debt you have on the property, so your mortgage. And in some instances, they won't pay your property manager's fee, so you have to pay that. So it's completely handoff, because they're responsible for everything. They don't need to go to you for anything. So the only times you ever really kind of have an issue is COVID, obviously. You get some people that come and they give you the financials and say, look, we're struggling with business. Can we have a rental concession? Or when you get to the end of the lease terms. So when you get to the end of the lease terms, but again, a good property manager will handle that. They'll come to you and say, hey, look, they're trying to negotiate this. This is where I think the market's at. Are you happy with that? So it's a complete hands-off one, which I really like.
So if you've got a lease term that's, say, 5 years, what's the expectation in the property manager? What's their general, follow-up or, checking in on the tenant? Is it the same process as residential, or is it quite different?
No, it's the exact same process. Every property manager is going to have their own kind of criteria in the way they operate, but normally you'd want to do an inspection every 6 months. But then their main aim is just to make sure that the tenant is doing what they're supposed to be doing, so upholding the lease. So that's paying their rates on time, making sure they've got adequate insurances like public indemnity and things like that, and that all the bills and rents and stuff are paid on time. So they'll just be monitoring that. Then they'll go and obviously monitor the condition of the property just to make sure they're not causing huge amounts of damage and things like that. But to be honest, like if you're buying a warehouse, there's not much you can do. It's 3 concrete tilt-up panels and a roller door. And if you're buying a suburban retail, the presentation of the actual retail is quite important to the tenant anyway. So most of the time, they're actually looking after it themselves. Like I own a cafe in Ipswich personally. It's just next to Ipswich Station. It's a little freestanding building. It's actually one of the ones I sent to my clients that I mentioned before, and they all said no to it. 10 car spots, development potential up to 42 meters. That tenant renovated the whole building for me free of charge. He actually came to my property manager and said, oh, we want to like render the outside of the building, put a new roof on, make the facades really nice. Is it okay if we do it? My property manager came to me. I'm just like, yes, you can increase the value of my property free of charge. So you get stuff like that. And it's a good indicator that I know they're going to be there long term as well. because if they're spending $50,000, $60,000 renovating the property, they're not planning to leave in 2 or 3 years. They're going to stay 5, 6, 7 years because they want to bring their business in because of the presentation.
Yeah. Question here: do you encourage your clients to use property managers or not?
Yes, 100% every single time. Same as residential. You can do it yourself because it is a bit easier. However, the legislation constantly changes. For me, it's when shit hits the fan, if I'm honest. Like, you want a property manager there who can look after it. I also like the disparity between the owner and the property manager, because the property manager can play on that. They can say, they can paint you as the evil owner, if need be, and they can be the nice guy, good cop, bad cop kind of one. And in the grand scheme of things, it doesn't cost that much. Like, you're paying a couple grand, $3,000 a year for a property manager to mitigate all that risk, all that hassle. And then at tax time, I get an end of financial year statement saying, there it is, Steve, send it to your accountant. That is way more useful. But I can imagine if I didn't have property managers during COVID, the amount of inquiries and stuff you'd get and staying up to date with the legislation and all of that, it's just not worth it for me. If you want to be an active investor, cool, you can probably manage it because it's not that much work, but I'd be wary if it turns bad. Tenants will always cry poor as well. I've never met a tenant who says to their owner, we are doing so well, we are making so much money, because guess what happens at lease renewal? You charge them top rent. So they're always going to cry poor. Being that direct point of contact, just get rid of it. Get a property manager every time.
Yeah, absolutely. And same thing with residential. I wouldn't have a property without a property manager there. Just creates that distance, like you said. Steve, I know that was you mentioned as well that you don't deal with a lot of development yourself. Have you developed commercial property? And
no, I haven't. So that's next life task for me, is to get involved in that. And that's actually why I've started. That's why I know the facts about how the big boys like have a less profit margin, things like that. So I'm slowly rolling into that. That's going to be a next task there. It's just
no, go ahead.
I was going to say, it's just like residential though. It's you need a lot more cash to kind of get in the game. And it's obviously going to halter my personal kind of investing as well, because it's going to be a 2-year process kind of thing. But hopefully the rewards are there as well.
Absolutely. And the reason I asked, not to sort of put you on the spot more than anything else, was to sort of say, well, the good thing with commercial is that you've got that income, because when you do development, there's no income.
Yep.
That you've got this level of cash flow that's happening in the background, so that you're not living off bread and water for 2 years as well. So yeah, there's that benefit of having a commercial portfolio along with doing developments on the side as well.
Yeah, and I always recommend diversification is always great. Like we'll have a chat about that. So like sometimes people ask me when do you know when commercial's right for you? Like when should you buy a commercial? And the answer is going to depend for everyone. Like if I've got a 60-year-old client and they want to retire in 5 years' time on a passive income, buying a neutrally geared residential property does not help them with that retirement plan. So even if they don't have a portfolio in residential, but they've got quite a lot of capital there, I'd probably recommend personally going to commercial, because it'll give them the cash flow instantly.
Yeah.
If I've got, say, on the flip side, a young client, a 20-year-old, and they don't own any properties, the main benefit of property is leveraging, using the bank's money to leverage. So while you're young, and I know they're going to be working the next 5, 10, 15 years, leverage. And with commercial, you can only get a maximum 80% LVR. Most of the time, it's 70% LVR. I would much rather that client go out and buy 3 residential properties on 10% loans and pay LMI, because you'll have a portfolio that's 3 times as large, probably similar cash flow. If he's buying cash flow positive residential, because he's got 3 times as much, if he's getting 3 or 4 or 5 grand a year positive out of those residential and he's buying 3 of them, he's probably getting close to the commercial rent anyway. And then if the market moves, he makes 3 times as much money. So there's that end of the spectrum. And then all the way in between, you've got the people with 2 or 3 residential properties. Some are getting towards their serviceability limit. So that's where you need to look at, cool, I need to do something different here. Otherwise, I'm going to buy, and this will be my last purchase for a while. Cool, commercial is an option. And then the other one is sometimes people just want to have a little passive income. So they might have the serviceability for residential, but their partner might be going on paternity leave, for instance, for a couple of years, and they go, oh, it'd be nice to have a little 30 grand passive income for that couple of years. Cool, commercial might be a right option then. So it's just weighing up what you're actually trying to achieve over what time frame versus what your risk profile is, and then decide from there.
Amazing. Awesome, Steve. I think that's been a fantastic segment. I want to have a quick segue to, obviously there's a book there. Tell us a bit about the book and how we can get our hands on it, because I'm sure everyone that's been listening here is going to be like, I want to learn more about commercial property now.
Yep, that's fine. So I actually didn't plan to write a book. I was actually on all my sales calls. I actually got sick of explaining commercial to every single client. Like all my calls were going for 2 hours because I was basically explaining what we've had a chat about today, plus all how leases work and outgoings and all that. So I'm like, cool, I'm going to write a little ebook where I'll send them that before the call so they can read that, so we can have a really good kind of conversation about strategy instead. And then 20 pages went to 50, 80 went to 120. I went, all right, there's a book here, and then wrote 300 pages. So got a book, a publisher, decided to publish it in stores and airports and stuff like that. So yeah, it's 300 pages on everything you need to know about commercial. It's not dream selling. It's like a textbook. So if you want to go to bed, just read it. It'll knock you out quite easily. But 300.
Osmosis, you sort of suck it all.
So just go to my website. If you want it for free, I'll send you a hard copy of it for free. Just type in the word free book on my website and I'll send you a copy.
So policeyproperty.com and head to, there's a part that says free book, or is it resources?
Free book. It's also in resources. There's also plenty of free spreadsheets and resources on there you can download.
Amazing. Thank you very much. Thank you, Steve. Well, anyone that's interested to either purchase their own commercial property, obviously do a whole lot of education and learning. If you sort of don't really feel that that's your thing, that's where Steve comes in. Tell us really, really quickly about what it is that you do.
All right. So I effectively just do the whole process for you. So I go out, I find the property for you, I do the negotiations, I do the due diligence, I hold your hand through the settlement process. So if you need a conveyancer, building pest inspector, property manager, valuer, I'll recommend all those along the way. But the crutch of the business is just getting you a really good low risk commercial that's got a high cash flow and capital growth prospects.
Amazing. So take my money. Oh, good, Steve. Thank you so much for all that sharing and knowledge. Anyone that wants to get in touch with Steve, he is pretty active on the socials, so Facebook, LinkedIn. So drop him a DM. He is the Steve, so you can't forget that. And he doesn't sleep because he's on the other side of the world. So when you're asleep, he's awake and hunting down properties as well. So thank you. Take care.
That was fun. Thanks, Cheryl.
No, not a problem. You take care. Keep well. Enjoy the skiing. And thank you, everyone, for joining us on this session of the Business of Property. If you enjoyed that session and you want to listen to replays of previous Business of Property episodes, please head over to Cheryl Leong on YouTube. Do the whole like and subscribe and notified when we have a new session. So till next week, take care, keep well, and stay safe. Bye-bye.